The 12th National People's Congress, or NPC, China's national legislature, opened its third annual session this morning at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. Premier Li Keqiang delivered his annual government work report. Nearly 3,000 NPC deputies from across the country were present, as were President Xi Jinping and other top Chinese Communist Party and state leaders. Premier Li focused the bulk of his speech on China's slowing economic growth and also pollution problem.
Representing China, 3,000 lawmakers gather in Beijing for their annual meeting. The focus this year, the economy and the environment, as China grapples with slower growth and a now acknowledged pollution crisis.
The target growth rate of approximately 7% takes into consideration what is needed and what is possible. The target is both aligned with our goal of finishing building a moderately prosperous society in all aspects and is appropriate in terms of the need to grow and upgrade our economy. It is also in keeping with the objective laws of development as well as conditions of China.
In the annual government work report, China's GDP growth target was set at around 7%. For major growth drivers, fixed asset investments are predicted to grow by around 15%. Chinese officials last year announced several major construction projects, including railways, roads and water resources, to boost domestic demand. Another focus, retail sales, is tipped to grow by 12%. The Premier said foreign trade would remain a growth driver, but faced with an uneven global recovery, should rise just 6%. The Premier set a target for urban job creation of more than 10 million new positions this year, and the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is tipped to increase 3%, a mild number amidst relatively fast expansion.
Over the past year, the international and domestic environments faced by China and its development have been complicated and challenging. The road to global economic recovery has been rough, with many ups and downs, and the performance of the major economies has been divergent.
In 2014, China failed to reach its growth target, instead hitting 7.4%. 13 million new jobs were created, according to the Communist Party figures, and CPI was kept within 2%. Growth has its downsides, and the Premier's speech focused heavily on the environment, reflecting public concerns over the country's pollution problem. Li described it as a blight on the country. His speech also reflected concerns over corruption at the local and central government levels and the conduct of Communist Party officials. 2015 is set to be an important year for China's leaders to realise the overall reform blueprint set back in 2013 and meet targets set in the country's most recent 5-year development plan. The session won't convene for another 12 months, by which time the public can judge whether this year's promises were more than just hot air.
Yes, right here on CCTV News and right here with us on World Insight. With me now in the studio, we have Mr. Gao Zhikai, who is our current affairs commentator. Meanwhile, Mr. Ender Tangen as well, our commentator with us in Beijing studio to talk about the ongoing 2 sessions here in China. And also joining us from Columbus, Ohio, Odette Shankar, professor at the Ohio State University. Welcome to the 3 of you, gentlemen. Earlier this morning, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang already delivered the government work report. A lot of important messages inside it. Well, of course, our colleagues have been combing through all of this information throughout the day, but it is very important for us now to wrap it up with a good discussion. 7%, gentlemen. Or shall we put it more accurately, approximately 7%. Let me have Professor Shankar first, because we did not hear your views, sir, throughout the day. What do you make of it?
Well, I think that the 7% number is not very surprising. I think that most people expected the growth to be lowered compared to last year. So that was not a very a big surprise. I think that there are many more important questions than that, such as how that will happen. And to me, even more importantly, is the question of what are the other goals. I mean, the leadership has made it clear that GDP is not going to remain as the most important exclusive goal for China to achieve. So how are these other indicator, quality of working life, pollution and so forth, what are the really benchmark that China want to achieve on those?
Interesting. That's an important question. You asked an important question.
Right
Let
now.
me have the answer coming from the two panelists in the Beijing studio. Mr. Gao, Professor Shankar asking, if not the GDP, what are the other benchmarks?
Well, GDP will still remain as an important benchmark, but it will no longer be almost the exclusive, overridingly important benchmark. Others, for example, the quality of the GDP, the sustainability of the GDP, whether energy efficiency can be emphasized, whether, for example, fairness and the transparency can be achieved, and the results or the achievements of the growth can be shared more equitably throughout the society. So I would say that going forward, in addition to maintain a steady, relatively speaking, still very high growth rate for China, we need to do much more in terms of better allocation of wealth and also more sustainable and more energy efficient growth.
Mr. Tangen, I've always been thinking, is it really the Chinese government that has been simplified the issue by summing up with a GDP number? Or is it, in fact, in coalition with the rest of the world? Because when people talk about China, they immediately talk about the GDP number and nothing else, as if that's the only benchmark. But if you look at the work reports that the Premier delivered last year, the year before last. In fact, it is very comprehensive and deal with a lot of areas, but people only remember whether it's 7.4 or it's only approximately 7%. What's going on with us?
Well, I mean, when China was in an investment-driven economy, obviously GDP was a natural way of trying to measure where China was going. But as China switches to a more qualitative, sustainable economy, that is not. Now the big issues are how many jobs you're creating, what is the disposable income of people who have things. And last year it grew by 8%, well above inflation. So this is a very, very positive sign. So when people are asking, oh, how is China able to go on things, you have to start looking at other indices, because this is not the same economy that it was 5 years ago. Very, very different, and this is what Li is trying to stress. He's talking about a balanced economy that includes consumption as well as exports.
Professor Shankar, does that make sense to you, particularly the fact that the two gentlemen mentioned, but I would like to repeat again, which is the Premier said the goal are likely to be two. One is medium to high growth rate. The other is medium high development. Those are two different things, but yet those two different things seem to interacting with one another. Professor Shankar, is that clear to you from an observer's perspective?
Well, the answer is yes and no. I mean, certainly when you're looking at GDP, this is moderate to growth, going down to 7% from the double digit that China had just a few years ago. So basically the signal there is, yes, we're going to have continuous growth, but at a more moderate level. And by the way, if you're looking at emerging economies that preceded China on the way up, such as Japan and South Korea, you will find a fairly similar trend. The second portion is obviously much more complicated. What does it really mean, moderate to high, development? The Chinese leadership often talks about China as still being a developing economy, and China is now ready to move into the next phase. But what does the next phase really implies, and how?
Let me talk about the next phase. We are here to.
My question is really about specifics.
Yeah, about specifics. We are here to talk about specifics, not only to ask specific questions, but also to give specific answers as well. So let me go to you first, Mr. Tangen. The Chinese Premier talked about two engines, once again dual, entrepreneurship, innovation. This is the very first time that you hear the Chinese Premier repeatedly said at the government work report, mentioning solutions regarding these two as a solution. How significant is it? Is it a choice? Is it words out of choice? Or rather, it is a choice being made because there seems to be no other solutions?
Well, it's not a question of solutions, it's a question of leadership, all right? We all know about the middle income trap and what has happened to many countries, especially in Southeast Asia, as they've reached what I call the Norris point, the point where your inefficient manufacturing and logistics cannot be made up by low-cost labor, and that's where China is headed right now. China wants to increase its jobs and also disposable income, which means that wages are rising. This is a good thing, but it also means that you have to be more efficient. All right, so to answer the professor's question, the specifics are that China needs to be a high-quality competitor, not to emerging countries, but to first world countries. The next target is Europe and the United States. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that China is trying to avoid the problems that have been demonstrated in the past.
All right. Innovation, entrepreneurship. You didn't mention too much about that, but so let me go to you, Dr. Gao.
No, that's the only way. That's the only way to do it. You cannot, no, you can't do it any other way. If you want quantity and you want efficiency, you're going to have to turn to technology and innovation.
Okay, entrepreneurship, is that really the way to go? What about the state-owned enterprises? What about the already established Chinese ones?
Well, I would say that we need to put this in historical context. 35 or 36 years ago, when China started the reform and opening to the outside world, we didn't have much. We didn't have capital, we didn't have technical know-how, we didn't have high-quality infrastructure, etc.
What about now?
Now, after tremendous amount of economic transformation, China has abundant supply of capital. China has built up probably the largest manufacturing capacity in many sectors. There is overcapacity, for example. Therefore, we can no longer do business in the old paradigm, that is just to learn from the others, just do the outsourcing for others, etc. Now we really need to come up with our own technical know-how and innovation.
You have to recognize the reality. 80% of the jobs being created in China are being done by small and medium-sized enterprises. These are entrepreneurial. If you're going to say that I want to ignore that and go with a declining SOE base, it's not possible.
If you rely on entrepreneurship, if you rely on innovation, you have to come up with policies exactly encouraging them to prosper. Did the Premier give any remedy in that regard?
No, I would say that the Premier, in his work report, seems to enumerate a long list of all the things that we are now faced with. There is, in my best judgment, a lack of solid and thorough, well thought after solutions.
I'm going to disagree with my colleague
I think
here.
Maybe
the
work report is just to present to the audience and to the whole nation what are the issues, what are the challenges, and then the delegates will need to debate among themselves in the coming few days. And then I think the CPPCC members need to come up with all the proposals and advices, and eventually I think by the end of this whole 10-day period, the whole nation will have a better way and better understanding as to what we need to do going forward.
There's different understanding of the procedure, Dr. Gao Zhikai. There seems to be also others proposing this is the work report, and what the deputies need to do really is to go through this work report, raise their suggestions, and also eventually they're going to decide whether they approve it or not because they are the representatives of the people. But let me go to you, Mr. Tang, and you mentioned about real solutions. What exactly is it? The policies to support entrepreneurship innovation. Is that being mentioned?
Absolutely. They've said they're streamlining government red tape, right? They're trying to improve the financial system by getting banks and other institutions and allowing new banks to offer the kind of services that are not currently being made. They're putting money into innovation centers. I mean, they're doing everything they can. I don't understand why somebody would say there is no blueprint. It's quite clear.
It is quite clear, but government work report, you know, I have to include everything in it. So Absolutely. It sounds like a talking point in a way, a list of talking points. Let me go to you, Professor Shankar. The other thing that the Chinese Premier talked about as the engine is the public service investment. Okay, here's the tricky thing. China was also having this huge public service investment which was the so-called stimulus package, as some say, that happened a few years earlier. At the time, it was the right choice because everybody's economy was not doing well. China had to do it. But now, how to make sure it's not going to be a size as it was? Well, at the same time, it's going to really encourage the real economy to develop with the so-called service investment. Sir.
Well, first of all, let me, if I may, say something about, the prior discussion. I mean, because it is related. Innovation has been kind of a buzzword for very many years in China, and now we got to the point where the leadership has made it into an explicit goal. But I want to make two observations about it. The first is that, as you may know, I've taken a bit of a contrarian perspective. I actually published a book about the virtues of imitation. In other words, the economic benefit is very often actually captured by imitators rather than innovators.
Okay, and your point is, please state your point directly, Professor. So you are saying China, there's no innovation because it's all imitation? Is that what you're saying?
No, my point is that innovation is not going to solve all the problems. Absolutely not.
Okay.
And the second and related point is innovation really something that can be dictated from above? Possibly not, right? And this is where a Chinese system faced, I would say, one of its biggest challenges, because the Chinese system has many advantages when it comes to the first early phase of development, but right now it is facing a very significant obstacle.
Right. I don't want to cut you short, but if you take a look at the government work report, there are actually specific points exactly would answer your question, whether there's going to be encouraging policies about that. But I still want to ask the question regarding the so-called service investment, because it's very important, public service investment. How are we going to distinguish it from the earlier huge stimulus package, which of course had its impact positively then, but not necessarily going to be appropriate now?
No, first of all, I would say...
Briefly, we got 2 minutes left.
Yes, the tremendous amount of infrastructure investment in railway, highway, airports, ports, for example, are still necessary. China is a vast country.
Right.
There is only a small part of China which has been covered more or less by high-quality infrastructure projects. But I think in the middle part and the western part in particular, we need to keep investing in this particular sector.
Final words from you, sir.
I think if you look at the policies he's voicing about education and looking at the long-term return on the things, that will be your answer.
All right. Well, this is a huge government work report. We can go into details about any point over there, but we are running out of time. But I'm sure all of the details will be studied because all the devils will be in the details. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you, Professor Uday Shankar from Ohio State University, in asking the question, how? And also Mr. Gao Zhikai here with us, and Mr. Tangen here in Beijing with us. Thank you.